I can still see her face in that moment. We were at the Hendersons' dinner party, their new place in Montecito, all floor-to-ceiling windows and that particular kind of silence that comes with wealth. Margaret had been drinking. Not much, just enough to let the mask slip. Someone asked me about my retirement plans and she laughed. Not a kind laugh. The kind that makes other people uncomfortable but not uncomfortable enough to say anything. His pension? She said, swirling her wine. It's modest. Very modest. We're managing, of course, but he'll never be comfortable the way some of us are. She gestured around the room, at their friends, at their lives, at everything she'd decided we should want but never quite had. I smiled. I always smiled. That was the agreement we'd made somewhere along the way, though I don't remember either of us signing it. I smiled and I said nothing, and that was the moment I decided she would never know. But let me back up. Let me tell you how a man goes from believing his wife loves him to understanding that she loves the idea of what he could be, and how he comes to terms with that in the quietest, most devastating way possible. This isn't a story about anger. I've never been an angry man. My father was angry, and I watched it destroy him from the inside out, so I learned early to keep things in the deeper rooms of myself, the ones where no one else could live or interfere. This is a story about a choice, about what you do when the person you've built a life with decides that the life you built together isn't quite good enough. About the moment you realize that honesty was a one-way street, and you were the only one paying the toll. 43 years. We'd been married 43 years when Margaret laughed at my pension in front of the Hendersons. It wasn't really about the money, not at first. That's the thing people never understand about these situations. It was never about the money. It was about the way she looked at me when we first started keeping score with other people's lives. It was the subtle shift in her voice when she talked about our future. It was the increasing coldness disguised as concern, as planning, as just wanting what was best for us. But yes, it was also about the money, because money, in the end, is just proof. Proof that you matter. Proof that your sacrifice meant something. Proof that the choices you made were worth the cost. I'd kept my finances quiet for nearly 2 years by that dinner party. Not hidden. I'm not a deceptive man by nature, but private. There's a difference, though most people don't understand it. The dividends came in quietly. The investments compounded in the background. And I watched my net worth grow in a separate column on statements she never saw. Not because I was scheming, but because I was listening. I was watching, and I was beginning to understand what Margaret actually saw when she looked at me. The question wasn't whether I should tell her. The question was what would happen when she found out I'd known all along what her laugh meant, and that I'd simply chosen not to give her the satisfaction of knowing what I was actually worth. That moment is coming. But first you need to understand who I was before the laughing started. I was 30 years old when I met Margaret at a university library. She was reshelving books in the economics section, a part-time job, she told me later, to pay for her business degree. I was there researching municipal bonds for a client. I worked for a small financial advisory firm in those days. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would impress anyone at a dinner party. But it was honest work and I was good at it. She had red hair then, the kind that caught the light. She wore it down, and when she turned to help me find a book, I remember thinking she had the sort of face that made you want to be better than you were. Not in a desperate way. In a quiet way, like you wanted to deserve to look at her. We talked for 3 hours that day. She told me about her dreams. She wanted to open a business, maybe something in retail or hospitality. She was smart about numbers, she said, but she wanted to understand people more. I told her about the markets, about the long game, about how patience was the only real superpower in finance. She listened the way some people listen to music, like it mattered. We married 2 years later. Small ceremony, her family and mine, nothing extravagant. She wore my grandmother's pearls. I remember thinking I was the luckiest man alive. For the first decade, we were happy in the way that young couples are, working hard, saving carefully, making plans that felt like they belonged to both of us equally. Margaret did open a business eventually, a small boutique hotel in Santa Barbara. It was successful, more successful than either of us expected. We bought a house in Montecito. Nothing ostentatious, but solid. 4 bedrooms, a garden she loved, a study where I kept my desk and my work. By 40, I'd built a modest but real portfolio. Real estate holdings, dividend stocks, bonds. Nothing flashy. I'd been conservative in a way that my younger colleagues thought was boring. But conservative compounds. Conservative survives recessions. Conservative by the time you're 50 means you don't have to worry anymore. Margaret's hotel was thriving. She managed it beautifully. She had a gift for making people feel welcome, for understanding what they needed before they asked. I was proud of her. Genuinely proud. When she won a local hospitality award in 1998, I took her to dinner at Chez Panisse and told her she was the most capable woman I'd ever known. She squeezed my hand under the table and told me she couldn't have done it without me. That was true then. I believed it. I think she did too. But somewhere in the early 2000s, something shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Margaret started talking about the homes our friends were buying. Not in Montecito, but in the hills, in Bel Air. Places where the houses were worth millions and came with infinity pools and guest houses. She mentioned casually that the Hendersons were considering a second home in Aspen, that the Carpenters had just joined an exclusive club in the desert. I wasn't threatened by it, or I didn't think I was. I suggested we could take vacations, see those places. She smiled and said it wasn't the same. Vacations were temporary. Home was permanent, she was right, of course. But I didn't realize then that she was making a distinction between my home and the home she wanted. Between the life I'd built and the life she'd decided we should have been building all along. It was around this time that Margaret began attending more events. Charity galas, gallery openings, wine tastings with the kind of women who wore names like labels. I was invited, of course, but I often worked late, or I had client meetings, or I simply didn't want to go. I preferred quiet evenings at home, reading financial journals, listening to her tell me about her day. But increasingly, she went without me. "You'd be bored," she'd say, kissing me on the cheek as she left, already adjusting her earrings in the mirror. And I'd agree, because it was easier than saying what I actually thought. That I was afraid of what she was becoming when I wasn't around to see it. She came home from these events with stories about people's second homes and investment portfolios and the cars their husbands drove. She'd mention these things the way other women mention recipes or books, casually, as if they were just part of ordinary conversation. But I could hear the calculation beneath it, the assessment, the growing awareness that the gap between what we had and what she wanted was widening, and that perhaps it was my fault for not widening it faster. I was making good money by then, very good money, but I was also watching the market, and I was seeing patterns that worried me. I was being careful, deliberate. I was thinking about the future in a way that wasn't flashy but was real. Margaret wanted now. By 50, I'd made some excellent investments that other people didn't see coming. A tech stock in 2003 that most advisors had written off. A real estate holding that tripled in value when the area was rezoned. A bond portfolio that weathered 2008 better than anything on the market. I was quietly, substantially wealthy. Not billionaire wealthy, but the kind of wealthy where you never have to worry again. Where you can retire at 60 if you want to. Where the dividend checks alone could fund a comfortable life indefinitely. I didn't tell Margaret the full extent of it. This is important. This is where the story actually begins. Not because I was hiding it maliciously, but because by the time I understood the magnitude of what I'd built, I also understood that Margaret's love for me had become conditional on my financial trajectory, and that knowledge changed everything. If I told her how much I was worth, she wouldn't see a man who'd planned well and invested wisely. She'd see confirmation that she'd been right all along, that the problem was I'd been holding back, not investing enough, not dreaming big enough. She'd see permission to want more, and I wasn't sure I had it in me to keep giving, so I didn't tell her. I kept working. I kept advising clients. I kept building. And I kept a part of myself, a crucial part, completely separate from her. The part where I was making decisions about our future that she didn't know about, didn't consent to, and wouldn't understand until it was too late. That was the moment I became a stranger in my own marriage. The moment trust became a luxury I could no longer afford. It started on a Tuesday morning in early 2019. Margaret came into my study with coffee. She always brought me coffee when she wanted to have what she called an important conversation. She was still in her bathrobe, her hair pulled back, her face arranged in an expression of gentle concern that I'd learned to recognize as the prelude to something difficult. "We need to talk about retirement," she said, settling into the leather chair across from my desk. Not sitting on the arm the way she used to, comfortable and close. Sitting formally like this was a meeting, I set down my pen. I'd been reviewing quarterly statements. The portfolios were performing well, better than well. I thought we had plenty of time, I said. I was 62. We'd talked vaguely about 65 or 67 as a target date, nothing urgent. "That's what I mean," she said, and there was something in her voice that made me look up from my work. "We don't have plenty of time." "Not really, not at our age." She took a sip of her coffee and I waited. Margaret was deliberate in conversation. She thought before she spoke, which was one of the things I'd loved about her when we were younger. But over the years, I'd come to understand that this deliberation was strategic. She was choosing her words, arranging them for maximum effect. "I've been reading about retirement planning," she continued, "and I've been talking to some of the women at the club. You know, Linda Carpenter and Susan Hendricks, and that woman from the benefit committee whose husband retired last year." I did know, or rather, I knew of them. Margaret had slowly built a life that revolved around these women and their collective knowledge of how to live well. I was adjacent to this life, not really part of it. "They were telling me about their husbands' retirements," she said. And something that kept coming up was the importance of really thinking ahead, of making sure you're not going to be caught short. "We're not going to be caught short," I said quietly. She smiled, but it was the smile you give to a child who doesn't understand something important yet. "You don't really know that, though, do you? I mean, you have your pension from the firm, which is modest." "It's adequate," I said, "and some investments, which is wonderful. But honestly, honey, I've been looking at some of the numbers and I'm worried. I'm worried that we're not going to have the kind of retirement we should have. That we're going to be comfortable, but not really comfortable, if you know what I mean." I knew exactly what she meant. Comfortable meant the house in Montecito. Comfortable meant vacations to Europe and membership at the club and being able to give generously to causes she cared about. Comfortable meant being able to look other women in the eye at the benefit gala and not wonder if they pitied her husband for his modest pension. "Margaret, I'm not saying this to hurt you," she interrupted, and her voice took on that particular tone that suggested she was about to say something that would, in fact, hurt me, but that she was doing it out of love. "I'm saying this because I care about us, about our future, and I think we need to have a serious conversation with a financial advisor, someone objective, someone who can really help us understand our situation." "I am a financial advisor," I said. She nodded, as if I'd proven her point. "Exactly. And maybe that's part of the problem. You're so close to it you can't be objective. You've been so focused on your work, on managing other people's money, that I'm not sure you've really taken a hard look at what we have." This was, I would later understand, the oldest manipulation in the book. Question his expertise, suggest that his judgment was compromised by proximity, make him doubt his own knowledge of his own life. "I know exactly what we have," I said. "Do you?" She leaned forward slightly. "Because the Hendersons just restructured their entire portfolio. They brought in someone from LA, very prestigious, and Susan was saying that he found all kinds of tax inefficiencies, opportunities they'd been missing for years. She said it was eye-opening. They're going to be able to retire in about 5 years instead of 10. Doesn't that sound like something we should be looking into?" I didn't respond immediately. I was watching her face, trying to see if the woman I'd married was still in there somewhere, or if she'd been completely replaced by this other version, the one who measured her life in comparison to other women's lives, who saw her husband's quiet competence as a failure to dream big enough. "I don't think we need a restructuring," I said finally. "See, that's what worries me," Margaret said. And now her voice had shifted into genuine concern, the kind that was almost worse than the patronizing tone. You're so satisfied with what you have. And that's a good quality, really it is. But it worries me that you're not thinking ambitiously enough. That you're content to just, coast. And then one day we'll wake up and we won't have the options we should have. We have options, I said. Do we? She stood up and walked to the window that looked out over our garden. The roses were blooming. She'd spent all spring tending them and they were beautiful. Because from where I'm standing, it feels like we're going to retire to this house and grow old here. And that will be fine. But it won't be great. It won't be the kind of retirement the Hendersons are planning. It won't be the kind of life I imagined we'd have. The last sentence hung in the air between us. The kind of life I imagined. Not we. What kind of life did you imagine? I asked. She turned from the window. Her face was soft, almost sad. A better one than this. I'm sorry, but it's true. I imagined we'd have more. Not just money, but options. Freedom. The ability to travel whenever we wanted, to help our children the way we should. To not have to think about money at all. The way people like the Hendersons don't have to think about it. The Hendersons think about money constantly, I said. That's why they have money. That's not what I mean, and you know it. She sat back down, and now her eyes were shining slightly, as if she might cry, which was her final and most effective weapon. I wanted us to do better, and I don't think we're going to, unless we make some serious changes. Unless you make some serious changes. The implication was clear. This was my failure. My inadequacy. My fault for not being ambitious enough, not dreaming large enough, not building a life that matched her vision of what our life should be. I'll look into some options, I heard myself say. The words came out automatically, the way they always did when faced with her disappointment. Agreement was easier than defense. Capitulation was simpler than standing my ground. She smiled then, that warm smile that suggested I'd finally understood something important. She came around the desk and kissed the top of my head. Thank you, she said. I knew you'd understand. I knew you'd want to do better for us. But it wasn't for us. It was for her. It was for her vision of us, which was a different thing entirely. After she left, I sat at my desk for a long time without moving. I looked at the financial statements in front of me, the ones that showed exactly how substantial my portfolio had become. I thought about the conversation we'd just had, the way she'd framed my competence as inadequacy, my stability as stagnation, and I made a decision. Not in anger, not even consciously at first, but some part of me decided in that moment that she would never know the full extent of what I was worth. Because if she knew this conversation would happen again and again, each time at a higher number, each time with the implication that I was still not doing enough, still not being enough, the dividends would keep coming in, the investments would keep compounding, and I would keep them to myself. It was the moment I became invisible to her, not because she stopped looking at me, but because I stopped letting her see me. I became a man with a secret, and that secret was the only thing left that was truly mine. 3 weeks after that conversation, Margaret brought home a folder. She set it on the kitchen counter while I was making dinner, and I could see the letterhead of a financial advisory firm from Beverly Hills, the same one the Hendersons used. I later learned. I made us an appointment, she said, opening a bottle of wine. Next Thursday. I think it will be really helpful to get an outside perspective. I didn't argue. I'd learned by then that arguing only extended the conversation, and extending the conversation meant more disappointment, more of that gentle concern that was actually a form of control. So I agreed. I went to the appointment. I sat in an office that cost more per square foot than our entire house and listened to a man named Derek, who was probably 15 years younger than me and wore a Rolex, that cost more than my first car, explain to us why our financial strategy was too conservative. For our life stage, you've built a solid foundation, Derek said, gesturing at the spreadsheets he'd generated from the information I'd provided. But you're leaving money on the table. You're thinking like someone who's afraid, not like someone who's confident in their future. Margaret nodded along, vindicated. I said nothing. What I'd recommend, Derek continued, is a more aggressive posture. Real estate development opportunities, some emerging market funds, perhaps even some private equity placements, if you're willing to look at those kinds of vehicles. You could easily double your portfolio in the next 5 to 7 years, if you're willing to take on a bit more risk. I could have told him that doubling my portfolio was unnecessary, that I already had more than enough. I could have explained that risk at our age was imprudent, that capital preservation was more important than capital growth. But Margaret was leaning forward, engaged, interested in a way she hadn't been when talking to me about our finances. So I listened. And then I did something I'd never done in our marriage. I started to lie. Not outright, not yet, but through omission and misdirection. I'll think about it, I told Derek, and I meant it. I would think about it. I would think about how Derek, working on commission, had every incentive to push me toward riskier investments. I would think about how Margaret, sitting next to me with that expression of hope on her face, had become someone I could no longer trust with the truth about my finances. 2 weeks later, Margaret brought home documents. They were on the kitchen table when I came home from the office. A packet from an estate planning lawyer. Another recommendation from the Henderson Circle. I thought we should update our wills, she said casually, as if this was a natural continuation of our previous conversation. And the lawyer mentioned some strategies for protecting our assets for tax efficiency. He suggested we might want to establish a joint account for our liquid assets so we can manage them more efficiently together. A joint account. I stared at the documents without opening them. What do you think? She asked. What I thought was this. A joint account meant she would have visibility into every transaction, every investment decision. It meant I would no longer have the privacy I'd come to value. It meant she would see the dividends I'd been receiving, the growth that Derek had deemed inadequate, but which was, in fact, substantial. I'll review the documents, I said, but I didn't sign them. I told her the lawyer needed to make some revisions, that I wanted to consult with my own counsel. I stalled. And in stalling, I made the first explicit choice to keep her out of something she believed she had a right to be part of. You're being strange about this, she said one evening, a note of frustration in her voice. Why wouldn't you want a joint account? What are you hiding? The question hung there, and I realized that she wasn't actually asking. She was accusing. She'd already decided that my reluctance meant something sinister. I'm not hiding anything, I said. I just want to make sure we're doing this properly. We are doing it properly. The lawyer said, I want my own lawyer to review it, I interrupted. And then more quietly, Margaret, I trust you. But I also want to protect both of us. This was a lie, or rather it was a truth that masked a larger lie. I did want to protect us, but I also wanted to protect myself. I wanted to protect the part of my life that was still mine, the part that she couldn't touch or diminish or reshape to fit her vision of what we should be. She didn't push further that night. But something shifted. I could feel it. The dynamic between us had changed in a subtle but permanent way. She'd offered me a form of partnership, full transparency, joint control, and I'd refused it. In refusing, I'd essentially said, I don't trust you enough to let you see all of me, and she knew it. Over the following months, Margaret became increasingly focused on financial conversations. Not the warm, collaborative kind we might have had, but rather a series of probing questions designed to understand exactly what I had and why I wasn't being more forthcoming about it. How much did your dividend check come in for this quarter? She'd ask casually, as if it was just making conversation. Adequate, I'd say. That's not an answer. It's the answer you're going to get. These conversations never escalated into fights exactly. They were too controlled for that, but they were loaded with resentment. She was beginning to understand that I was withholding information, and she was angry about it. And I was becoming someone I didn't quite recognize. Someone who kept secrets from his wife, who answered her questions with deflection, who had begun to see her not as a partner, but as a threat. At night, I started opening a separate email account. I changed the passwords on my brokerage accounts. I set up alerts so that I would see any attempts to access my financial information before she could. I became, in essence, a man compartmentalizing his life, hiding the most important parts of himself in places she couldn't reach. One evening, she came into my study where I was reviewing statements. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me, and then she said, "You know, if you don't trust me with your finances, how can I be expected to trust you with anything else?" It was a threat barely veiled. It was also, I thought, fair. I wasn't trustworthy anymore, not in the way a husband should be. But I also wasn't willing to be vulnerable to someone who'd already shown me that my vulnerability would be used against me. "I trust you," I said, closing the laptop. "But trust isn't the same as transparency." "For most people it is," she said. After she left, I sat in the darkness of my study for a long time. I thought about the man I'd been when we married. Open, willing to be known, believing that love meant letting someone see all of you. I thought about the man I'd become, guarded, secretive, keeping score in a ledger that only I could see. And I understood in that moment that the marriage was already over. We were just still living in the same house, still pretending that something meaningful existed between us. The rest was just a matter of time and circumstances, of waiting for the moment when the pretense would finally shatter and everyone would see what had actually been true all along. That moment was coming. I just didn't know yet how publicly it would arrive. The dinner at the Hendersons happened on a Saturday in late October. We'd been invited weeks earlier, and Margaret had spent considerable time planning what to wear, how to present herself. She wanted to look successful. She wanted to look like someone whose husband had done well. I almost didn't go. I was tired that day in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. Tired of the performance. Tired of watching Margaret navigate conversations with other women, as if life were a competition with a scoreboard that only they could see. But she'd asked me to come, and I'd agreed, because that's what I did. I showed up. I played my part. The Hendersons' home was exactly what I expected. All clean lines and expensive art and the kind of carefully curated comfort that comes from never having to worry about money. Margaret knew most of the women there. She moved through the rooms with confidence, her dress perfectly chosen, her smile perfectly calibrated. I watched her from across the living room, speaking with Susan and Linda, and I could see her performing a version of herself that didn't quite exist. A woman whose husband was ambitious, successful, someone to be envied. I was at the bar ordering a scotch when I overheard the conversation. It was Margaret and Susan Hendricks, and they were standing in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen, positioned in a way that suggested they thought they were having a private conversation. But the acoustics of the space carried their words to me clearly. Or perhaps I was simply attuned to listen. Perhaps some part of me was always waiting for the moment when her mask would slip. "He's talking about retiring," Margaret was saying, and there was something in her voice that I'd never heard before. Not quite contempt, but something adjacent to it. A dismissal. Can you imagine? At 62? When we have no real savings to speak of, when we're not prepared at all. Susan made some sympathetic noise. "His pension is just... It's so small," Margaret continued. "And he made some decent investments over the years, but nothing that would really sustain us. He keeps telling me not to worry, that we'll be fine, but how can we be fine? How can anyone be fine on what he's built?" I set the scotch down carefully on the bar. I didn't look at her. I looked straight ahead at the reflection of the room in the mirror behind the bottles, watching Margaret's face as she spoke about me to a woman I barely knew. I thought maybe if we were more strategic, if we brought in someone professional, we could turn things around, Margaret said. But he's so resistant. He won't even let me access our accounts properly. It's like he doesn't want me to help. Like he's content to just coast into retirement and hope for the best. Susan said something I couldn't quite hear, but Margaret laughed. Not her social laugh. Her real laugh. The one that meant genuine amusement. "Honestly, sometimes I wonder what I was thinking," Margaret said. "Marrying someone with such limited ambition. The other women, their husbands are building things, creating wealth, taking risks. And mine just wants to manage what he has and call it enough." It's pathetic, really, pathetic. That was the word she'd used. Not disappointing. Not inadequate, pathetic. I picked up the scotch and drank it in one long pull. The burn in my throat was welcome. It gave me something to feel besides the hollow cold that was spreading through my chest. I excused myself and went to the restroom. I locked the door and stood in front of the mirror looking at my own face. I was still the same man who'd walked in that door an hour earlier. Still the same man who'd worked 40 years in the financial industry, who'd built a substantial portfolio through careful planning and disciplined investing, who'd sacrificed his own ambitions so that Margaret could open her hotel and pursue her dreams. But I was also a man whose wife found him pathetic. When I came out, I went back to the party. I stood next to Margaret for the rest of the evening, my hand on the small of her back, playing the part of the devoted husband. She didn't seem to notice anything different about me. She was too engaged in her performance, too focused on the impression she was making on the other women in the room. On the drive home, she talked about the party. She talked about Susan's new car, Linda's upcoming trip to Cabo, the Mitchells' plans to buy a second home in Aspen. She talked about everything except the conversation I'd overheard. "Did you have a nice time?" she asked as we pulled into our driveway. "Lovely," I said. "The Hendersons' home is really something, isn't it? I keep thinking about how perfect it would be if we could do something like that. Redesign the house, put in a pool, make it really showcase-worthy." I didn't respond. I was thinking about the word she'd used. Pathetic. I was thinking about what it meant to be married to someone who saw you that way. Not as a partner. Not as a man who'd done his best and built a life, but as a disappointment, a cautionary tale, a failure. That night, after Margaret fell asleep, I went into my study and pulled out the financial statements I kept locked in a drawer. I looked at the numbers. The growth over the past 5 years alone was substantial. The dividend income had nearly doubled. The real estate holdings had appreciated significantly. I was, by any reasonable measure, a wealthy man. Margaret knew none of this. Or rather, she knew some of it in the abstract, but she didn't understand the magnitude. She didn't understand that the small pension she mocked was supplemented by income streams she wasn't aware of. She didn't understand that the limited ambition she found pathetic had actually resulted in a life of considerable financial security. And that was the moment I made the decision. Not consciously. Not with any deliberate malice. But something in me shifted, crystallized, became irrevocable. She had decided who I was, a pathetic man with limited ambition. And I was going to prove her right in the way that mattered least, which was financially. I was going to keep building, keep accumulating, keep my money separate from her. And when the time came, and I understood, standing in my study at 2 a.m, that such a time would come, she would understand exactly what she'd thrown away. The next morning, I called a divorce attorney, not to file papers immediately, but to understand my options, to know, in concrete terms, what my financial position would be in the event of a separation, to protect myself in the only way I knew how. I didn't tell Margaret. I didn't tell anyone. I simply added another compartment to my life, another secret, another layer of distance between us. The marriage continued. We still slept in the same bed, still had dinner together, still performed the rituals that maintained the appearance of partnership. But something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer trying to bridge the gap between who I was and who she wanted me to be. I'd accepted the gap. More than that, I'd begun to widen it deliberately. Every dividend reinvested was a statement. Every account I kept private was a boundary. Every conversation where I deflected her questions about finances was a small act of rebellion against the idea that she had a right to know me completely. And with each passing week, the moment of reckoning drew closer. I could feel it the way you can feel a storm moving toward you from across the ocean. Inevitable, irreversible, coming. It happened through a phone call in the spring of 2021. Margaret answered a call on the house phone, something she rarely did anymore, most of her communication happening through her cell. I was in the kitchen when I heard her voice shift become suddenly formal, almost confused. "Yes, this is she," she said. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" I didn't look up from the newspaper I was reading, but I was listening. "No, I don't think there's been a mistake," she continued. "But, may I ask how you received this number?" "I see, well, that's..." I'll need to speak with my husband about this." She hung up. I could feel her standing in the doorway to the kitchen, waiting for me to acknowledge her. When I finally looked up, her face was arranged in a careful expression of neutrality, but there was something underneath it. Confusion. Suspicion. "That was someone from Merrill Lynch," she said. "They were calling to confirm some dividend reinvestment instructions." I set the newspaper down slowly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "They mentioned a separate account," she continued. "In your name only. They said there were recent transactions, something about dividend payouts being reinvested in a growth fund. They wanted to verify that the instructions came from you directly." "It's a business account," I said, which was true and false simultaneously. True in that it was technically separate from our household finances. False in that it was no longer strictly business. It had become something else entirely. A refuge, a statement. "A line in the sand, a business account?" she repeated. "You haven't worked at the firm for 3 years. I still manage my own portfolio," I said. She came fully into the kitchen and sat down at the table across from me. Her movements were controlled, but I could see the tension in her jaw. "How much?" she asked. "How much what?" "Don't," she said, and her voice had taken on an edge I hadn't heard in years. "Don't do that. How much money is in this account?" I picked the newspaper back up. "It's complicated." "It's not complicated. It's simple. You have money you haven't told me about, and I want to know how much. Margaret, how much?" Her voice was quiet now, but it was the quietness of controlled fury. "Just tell me the number." I could have told her. It would have been simple, but I understood in that moment that this was the beginning of the end, and I wasn't going to surrender to it without making her understand what I was fighting for. "It's personal," I said. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the tile. "Personal? We're married. There is nothing personal. Everything we have is ours." "Not everything," I said. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the realization dawning on her face. Not just that I had money she didn't know about, but that I had deliberately kept it from her. That I'd made a conscious choice to have something that was mine and only mine. "How long?" she asked. "How long what? How long have you been hiding this?" "I'm not hiding anything," I said. "I'm simply not sharing everything." "There's a difference. Not to me, there isn't." She turned away from me, her hands clenched at her sides. "I can't believe this. I can't believe you would do this. After everything, after all these years, after asking me to be honest with you about my business, to let you advise me on decisions, you're keeping secrets." "You asked me for advice," I said quietly. "You didn't listen." She spun back around. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that when I told you to be conservative, you spent money anyway. When I suggested we focus on capital preservation, you wanted Derek to restructure everything. You didn't want my advice. You wanted me to agree with what you'd already decided." "That's not fair," she said. "Neither is calling me pathetic at a dinner party," I replied. The words hung in the air between us. She'd gone very still. "You heard that," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes. You've known for months?" "Since October," I confirmed. "And you've done, what, hidden money? Opened secret accounts?" Her voice was rising now, the careful control beginning to crack. "How much, David? I need you to tell me right now how much money you have that I don't know about." I looked at her, really looked at her. At the woman I'd married 43 years ago, at what she'd become, at the distance that had grown between us like something alive, something that fed on our mutual disappointment. "Enough," I said finally. "Enough that you'll never have to worry about money again. Enough that you can retire whenever you want. Enough that the pension you found so pathetic won't matter at all." "Stop," she said. "Stop trying to make this about me. This is about you lying. This is about you not trusting me." "I don't trust you," I said. "Not anymore. Not since I understood that you'd decided I wasn't good enough before I ever got the chance to show you what I was actually capable of." She left the room. I heard her go upstairs, heard the bedroom door close with a careful, controlled click that was somehow worse than a slam. That evening, she called her sister. I didn't listen in directly, but I could hear the murmur of her voice through the bedroom door. the way her tone shifted between anger and hurt. I knew what she was telling her, that I was hiding money, that I was being deceptive, that I was betraying her trust. And some of that was true. But not all of it. The next day, Margaret called an attorney. I found the business card on the kitchen counter, knew immediately what it meant. I didn't say anything. I simply called my own attorney and told him to be prepared to move forward with the paperwork. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, who'd been advising me quietly for the past year, seemed unsurprised. "How much do you want to reveal?" she asked. "Just enough," I said. "Let her see what she missed by not paying attention." It took 3 days for her to dig deeper. She got copies of statements, not everything, but enough. The account balances, the dividend income, the real estate holdings that had nearly tripled in value since we'd purchased them, the growth that Derek had said was possible, but that I'd quietly been achieving all along. I was in my study when she came to the door. She didn't knock. She simply opened it and stood there holding papers, her face a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite parse. "There's almost $2 million, she said flatly. I didn't respond. $2 million, she repeated, her voice breaking slightly. "And you let me think we were struggling. You let me feel inadequate about your career. You let me ask for more, for better, when you had this all along." "No," I said quietly. "I let you make assumptions. I never told you we were struggling. You decided that on your own. Because you hid it from me," she said. "Because you didn't ask the right questions," I replied. "You asked me how much the dividend checks were. I told you they were adequate. You could have pushed for specifics. You chose not to. You chose to believe what you wanted to believe, which was that I wasn't doing enough, that I was pathetic." She flinched at the word, but she didn't deny it. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately. I was thinking about that moment at the Hendersons, about the way she'd dismissed me to someone else, about the choice I'd made in my study at 2 a.m. to protect myself. "I think," I said finally, "we need to talk to lawyers." The color drained from her face. She understood in that moment what was coming. Not just the revelation of money, but the implications of it. The fact that I'd been planning this, preparing for this, waiting for it. "David," she started, but I'd already turned back to my desk. The conversation was over. The quiet revelation had become something else entirely. The moment before everything fell apart. When both of us finally understood that there was no going back to what we'd been, the real battle was about to begin. The offices of Patterson and Associates occupied the entire 42nd floor of a building in downtown Los Angeles. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, all steel and glass and the kind of impersonal beauty that comes from money and distance. Patricia Chen had chosen this location deliberately, I understood. Neutral territory, professional, a space designed to strip emotion from difficult conversations. Margaret arrived with her own attorney, a woman named Rebecca Sutton, who specialized in high-net-worth divorces. I'd learned through Patricia that Sutton had a reputation for aggressive positioning, for finding every possible angle to maximize her clients' settlements. She would be formidable. We sat across a conference table, Margaret and Rebecca on one side, Patricia and I on the other, with a court reporter recording everything. It was late April, 6 weeks after the phone call from Merrill Lynch. 6 weeks of lawyers and discovery and the slow, methodical dismantling of a marriage that had lasted 43 years. "Before we begin," Patricia said, "I want to be clear about what we're dealing with. My client has been transparent about his financial position. All accounts, all holdings, all income streams have been disclosed. The suggestion from Ms. Sutton's office that there are hidden assets is unfounded. That's yet to be determined," Rebecca replied smoothly. "My client received a phone call from a financial institution that referenced accounts she had no knowledge of. That suggests a deliberate effort to conceal assets. The accounts are in my client's name," Patricia said. "He had no legal obligation to commingle them with marital assets. He maintained them separately and disclosed them as soon as he was asked directly." I watched Margaret's face as they spoke about me as if I wasn't there. She looked older than she had a few weeks ago. The lines around her eyes seemed deeper. She was wearing a tailored suit in dark blue, the kind of outfit designed to project competence and control. But there was something brittle about her now, something that suggested the control was costing her. "Let's talk about the timeline," Rebecca said, opening a folder. "My client recalls several conversations over the past 2 years regarding retirement planning, regarding the need for more aggressive investment strategies, regarding the restructuring of assets to maximize returns. During all of these conversations, my client's husband was maintaining substantial accounts that were not disclosed. My client was maintaining separate business accounts," Patricia corrected, "and he was not evasive about their existence. When directly questioned, he provided full disclosure. After being identified by a third party," Rebecca countered. "That's not voluntary disclosure. That's being caught." I felt Patricia's hand touch my arm, a signal to stay calm. But I was calm. I'd been preparing for this moment for months. I knew exactly what I wanted to say, and I was waiting for the right moment to say it. "Let's discuss the dividends," Rebecca continued, sliding a statement across the table. "Over the past 3 years alone, my client's husband received approximately $420,000 in dividend income. Income that could have been used for marital purposes, for their joint retirement, for the advancement of their shared financial goals. Income that my client earned through his own labor and prudent investment decisions," Patricia said. "And income that my client reinvested at a rate of return that has substantially outperformed the market. The question of how he chooses to use his own earnings is not the court's concern." "It is the court's concern," Rebecca said, "when there's evidence of intent to shield those earnings from marital discovery." That's when I leaned forward. Patricia glanced at me, and I shook my head slightly. I was going to speak. "I'd like to address this," I said quietly. Rebecca smiled, the thin smile of someone who'd just been handed an opportunity. "Of course, Mr. Carson, please." I looked directly at Margaret for the first time since we'd entered the room. "I didn't hide these accounts to deceive you," I said. "I hid them because you made it clear that my financial management wasn't adequate. You made it clear that my choices, my strategies, my entire approach to building wealth was insufficient." Margaret's attorney put a hand on her arm, but Margaret waved her off. "That's not— You asked Derek to restructure our portfolio," I continued, my voice remaining level. "You wanted more risk, more growth, more everything. But I had a different view. I believed in preservation. I believed in building slowly, carefully, without jeopardizing what we'd already created. And when I expressed that view, you dismissed it. Because you were being too conservative," Margaret said, her voice rising slightly. "Because we were going to retire with nothing. We were going to retire with more than enough," I said. "But you wouldn't listen. You'd already decided that enough wasn't possible, that I wasn't capable of providing enough. So I stopped trying to convince you and simply did what I thought was right. By hiding money from me," she said. "By keeping my own counsel," I corrected. "There's a difference. I didn't prevent you from accessing our joint accounts. I didn't prevent you from making investments. I simply didn't share every decision I made with someone who'd already made up her mind that those decisions were inadequate." Rebecca tried to interject, but I wasn't finished. "At the Hendersons' dinner party in October, you told Susan Hendricks that you found me pathetic," I said. The words were calm, factual, delivered without inflection. "You said my ambition was limited. You said you wondered what you'd been thinking, marrying someone without sufficient drive. You said it was pathetic." Margaret's face had gone very pale. She looked at her attorney, then back at me. "I heard that conversation," I continued. "And in that moment, I understood that you didn't see me as a partner. You saw me as a disappointment, a cautionary tale. So I made a decision. I decided that I would build my own future, separate from your expectations and your judgments. And that's what I did. You built it while still being married to me," Rebecca said. "While you were asking her to trust you with household decisions, with business advice regarding her hotel. While you were maintaining the appearance of partnership. I maintained the appearance of marriage," I said, "because I was still married. But I stopped trying to convince someone who'd already made up her mind about who I was. I protected myself. And yes, I did so deliberately." There was a long silence. The court reporter's fingers were still moving across the keys, capturing every word. "The accounts in question," Patricia said, "represent approximately $2.3 million in assets, plus ongoing dividend income. These were built entirely from my client's separate property earnings and prudent reinvestment. There are no marital funds commingled with these accounts. My client is offering a settlement that includes full disclosure of all assets, a buyout of the marital residence at current market value, and a fair division of all other jointly held property. What he is not offering is a division of assets that were built separately and maintained separately throughout the marriage. Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but Margaret put her hand up. She was looking at me, and I could see something shifting in her expression. Not sympathy, it was too late for that, but perhaps understanding. "How much are you offering?" she asked, her voice smaller now. Patricia slid a document across the table. Margaret opened it and read. I watched her face as she absorbed the numbers. It was more than fair. More, perhaps, than she deserved given what I knew about her intentions, about the planning she'd presumably done with Rebecca. It would allow her to maintain her lifestyle, to pay for the hotel's expansion if she wanted, to live comfortably for the rest of her life. "This is based on maintaining the house," Margaret said. "Yes," Patricia confirmed. "A full buyout at market value, approximately $3.2 million. Retirement accounts, split according to state law. The business interest in the hotel evaluated and split. Half of all jointly held investments in real estate. What's excluded are the separately maintained accounts and the dividend income from assets built prior to the dissolution." Margaret set the document down. She looked exhausted. "I didn't think you were capable of this," she said to me. "I didn't think you had it in you. To plan something like this, to wait, to protect yourself like this." "I didn't think so either," I said, "until you decided I wasn't enough." Rebecca was making notes, her mind already working through counteroffers and strategy. But Margaret wasn't done. "Did you ever love me?" she asked. The question hung in the air. Patricia was about to object, but I stopped her with a gesture. "Yes," I said. "I did, very much. But love isn't the same as blindness, and I learned over time that your love was conditional. Conditional on what I could provide, on who I could become, on whether I matched the image you had in your head of what a successful husband should be. And I realized I couldn't meet that condition because the condition kept changing." "That's not fair," she said. "No," I agreed. "It wasn't, but neither was calling me pathetic." Rebecca closed her folder and turned to Margaret. "We'll need to discuss this. I don't recommend accepting without exploring other options." "There are no other options," I said quietly. "This is what I'm offering. It's more than fair. If you choose to litigate, the court will likely award you less. But that's your decision to make." We stood to leave. Patricia gathered her papers, and I followed her toward the door. As I passed Margaret's chair, she looked up at me. And for a moment, I saw the woman I'd married all those years ago. The one who'd listened to me talk about bonds in a library, who'd brought me coffee in my study, who'd believed in me before she decided to believe in other people's assessment of me instead. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. I paused, but I didn't turn around. "So am I said. And I meant it. Patricia and I rode the elevator down in silence. When we reached the lobby, she turned to me and said, "That was effective. Emotional without being melodramatic. They'll likely accept something very close to what we offered." "She'll accept," I said. "Rebecca will push, but Margaret will accept. She's already understood that she's lost." "Is that what you wanted?" Patricia asked. "To make her understand that she'd lost?" I thought about the question as we walked through the lobby toward the street. The sun was bright, the afternoon warm. Los Angeles looked the way it always did. Indifferent, beautiful, utterly unconcerned with human drama. "No," I said finally. "What I wanted was to make her understand that I was worth something. That I was worth something even if she couldn't see it. And I think in that room she finally did." The settlement was finalized in August. Margaret accepted something very close to what we'd offered initially. The lawyers had haggled over details, had pushed and pulled at the numbers, but in the end, the fundamental structure remained unchanged. She received the house, a substantial settlement, half of the joint retirement accounts, and her business interest in the hotel intact. I retained the separately held assets and the dividend income. There was no drama in the signing. We met one final time in Patricia's office, and Margaret signed the papers with the same controlled precision she'd brought to everything else. She didn't look at me. I didn't try to make her. Afterward, I returned to the home we'd shared for 30 years and began the process of moving out. I'd rented a condominium in Santa Monica, nothing flashy but clean, modern, with a view of the ocean and a study large enough for my work. I moved methodically, taking what was legally mine, leaving what belonged to her or what we'd accumulated together. She was at the hotel during most of this. I was grateful for that. I didn't want to have to navigate her presence in rooms that had become foreign to both of us. On the last day, I walked through the house one final time. The roses in the garden were blooming. Margaret had hired a service to maintain them after I'd moved out, and they were as beautiful as they'd always been. The kitchen where we'd had our conversation about Derek and restructuring, the study where I'd made my decision at 2 in the morning, the living room where we'd sat on Sunday mornings with coffee, before everything had shifted toward comparison and disappointment. I stood in each room and felt the absence of feeling. Not sadness exactly, not anger, simply the recognition that something had ended, and that ending had been necessary. Even if it had been inevitable from the moment she'd laughed at my pension in front of the Hendersons. My attorney called a week later. "She's decided to sell the house," Patricia said. "Her lawyer indicated she's going to use the proceeds to expand the hotel business. She's planning to open a second location in San Diego." "Good," I said. "That's what she wanted. She wanted you to build that for her," Patricia corrected gently. "Or rather, she wanted you to fund it. Now she'll do it herself." "Then I'm glad the settlement gave her the means," I said. There was a pause on the line. "You're being remarkably magnanimous about this." "I'm not being magnanimous," I replied. "I'm being practical. I got what I needed. Security, independence, control over my own future. She got what she needed, the means to build something on her own terms. There's no reason for me to begrudge her that. But it was more than practicality. Over the weeks following the settlement, I began to understand something that I hadn't fully grasped during the confrontation in Patricia's office. The reversal, the moment when the power dynamic shifted and she understood what she'd lost, wasn't actually about me winning and her losing. It was about both of us finally seeing clearly. She saw that I had been capable all along, that my competence hadn't been limited or pathetic, that I'd simply been operating according to principles she'd rejected. And in that seeing, she understood that the problem wasn't my inadequacy. It was her judgment, her insistence on measuring a life against someone else's life, her inability to be satisfied with enough. And I saw that in holding on to the secret, in building a separate future without her, I'd become someone I didn't particularly like. I'd become someone who kept score, who withheld information, who protected himself by remaining distant. The money was a perfect metaphor for everything else I'd kept from her, not out of malice, but out of the quiet, corrosive conviction that she wouldn't understand, wouldn't appreciate, wouldn't respect it if I shared it with her. We were both right about each other, which was perhaps the saddest part. 3 months after the settlement was final, I received a phone call. It was from Linda Carpenter, Margaret's friend from the club. "I thought you should know," Linda said, "that Margaret is doing remarkably well. She's thrown herself into the expansion project. She seems lighter somehow, happier than I've seen her in years." I thanked Linda for calling, though I wasn't sure why she'd felt compelled to do so. Perhaps she thought I'd want to know. Perhaps she thought it would hurt me, and she wanted to deliver that hurt personally. Or perhaps she simply needed to tell someone that Margaret hadn't been destroyed by the dissolution, and I was the most logical person to tell. "I'm glad," I said, and I meant it. Not in a magnanimous way, but in a genuinely glad way. The expansion of her business was something she'd wanted. If she was happy, then at least something good had come from the wreckage. But I also understood something that Linda wouldn't have understood. Margaret's happiness wasn't because of the settlement I'd given her. It was because she no longer had to compare herself to me. She no longer had to measure her success against my relative failure in her eyes. She could build something on her own terms, without the constant undertone of disappointment that had colored our marriage for the last 15 years. In a strange way, I'd given her the greatest gift I could have given her by leaving. Freedom from me. Freedom from the idea of what I should have been. At my condo, I established a routine. I still did some consulting work, advising a select group of clients on investment strategy. The dividend income continued to come in, steady and substantial. I began reading more, traveling occasionally, developing friendships with people who weren't connected to my marriage or my career. I had dinner one evening with an old friend, Robert, someone I'd known since college. We sat at a restaurant overlooking the water, and he asked me about Margaret. "She's fine," I said. "Better than fine, probably. She's building her hotel empire, which is what she wanted all along." "And you?" he asked. "I'm learning how to be alone," I said, "which turns out to be something I'm actually quite good at." "That's not the same thing as being happy," Robert observed. "No," I agreed. "But it's not the same thing as being miserable either. It's something in between. It's peace, maybe, or at least the beginning of it." I thought about that conversation often in the months that followed. Peace. It wasn't the word I would have used a year ago. A year ago, I would have talked about vindication, about being right, about having the last word. But those words had lost their meaning somewhere along the way. The truth was simpler and more difficult. I had been capable of building something substantial. Margaret had not recognized that capability. I had then become someone who needed her to know she was wrong about me, which meant I was defining myself in opposition to her judgment rather than in affirmation of my own worth. The money had been the mechanism for that reversal, the moment when she was forced to acknowledge that she'd misjudged me. But the real reversal wasn't about the money at all. It was about understanding that I didn't need her acknowledgement to know my own value. That was worth more than $2.3 million. That was worth everything I'd built and everything I'd sacrificed to build it. And that was, finally, enough. A year after the settlement was finalized, I sat in my study in Santa Monica and looked at the view of the ocean. The condo was quiet in the way that only a space inhabited by one person can be quiet. Not lonely. I'd learned to distinguish between the two. Loneliness was a feeling. Quiet was simply the absence of noise. I was 64 years old. I had more money than I would ever need. I had no one to answer to, no expectations to meet except my own, no need to justify my choices to anyone but myself. By any reasonable measure, I had won. I had been right. I had built something substantial and kept it, and when challenged, I had proven my worth beyond any doubt. So why did it feel so hollow? The answer, I think, came to me gradually, not all at once. It wasn't a revelation so much as a slow, creeping understanding that accumulated over months of solitude and reflection. I had been right about my financial acumen. The numbers prove that. I had been right about the value of conservative investing, about the power of patience and discipline. I had been right to protect myself when I understood that Margaret was no longer operating from a place of partnership. But I had also been wrong about something equally important. I had decided that the solution to being underestimated was to become unknowable. The solution to being dismissed was to become distant. The solution to feeling inadequate was to prove my adequacy in a realm where she couldn't see it, couldn't question it, couldn't diminish it with a laugh or a dismissive comment. And in doing those things, I had lost something that no amount of money could replace. I had lost the possibility of being truly known by another person. I had lost the vulnerability that real partnership requires. I had lost the chance to say to her, clearly and without defensiveness, "I am enough as I am, and if you can't see that, the problem is yours, not mine." Instead, I'd said it with money. I'd said it with a settlement that proved I'd been more capable than she'd believed. I'd said it with the silent, corrosive satisfaction of knowing that she'd been wrong about me. And yes, those things were true. But truth delivered as a weapon is still a weapon, and weapons destroy things, including the wielder. Margaret had called me once, about 6 months after the separation. It was early evening, and I was sitting on my balcony watching the sun move toward the horizon. "I wanted to apologize," she said without preamble, "for what I said about you to Susan. I've thought about it every day since you mentioned it in Patricia's office, and I wanted you to know that I was wrong, that I didn't mean it. Or rather, I meant it in the moment. But I didn't understand what I was saying." I listened to her voice, older now, softer, carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "I was scared," she continued. "I think that's the truth I didn't want to face. I was scared that we weren't going to be okay, that we weren't going to have enough. And instead of saying that, instead of being honest about my fear, I made it your fault. I made you the problem. You did, I said quietly, I know. And I'm sorry. I'm not asking you to forgive me. Just wanted you to know that I understand now what I did. I understand that I was comparing our life to other people's lives and finding ours inadequate. And I made you responsible for that inadequacy, when really it was my own insecurity. I didn't respond immediately. The sun was setting, painting the ocean in shades of orange and purple, and I was thinking about how strange it was that she'd called to apologize at the exact moment when an apology couldn't undo anything. I appreciate you saying that, I said finally. And I'm sorry, too, for not being honest with you about my finances, for letting resentment build instead of addressing it directly, for becoming someone who kept secrets instead of someone who shared truth. We were both failing, she said. Yes, I agreed. We were. After she hung up, I sat in the darkness and thought about marriage in a way I hadn't allowed myself to think about it before. Not as a scorecard where you kept track of who was winning and who was losing. Not as a transaction where you calculated what you were owed based on what you'd contributed, but as something much more fragile and much more important, a mutual agreement to be known and to know another person, fully and without reservation. We had failed at that, both of us. She had decided to know me through the lens of her expectations and had dismissed me when I didn't fit. And I had decided to protect myself by remaining unknowable, which was another form of dismissal. We had been two people living in the same house, moving further apart with every year that passed. The money had simply been the final evidence of how far apart we'd drifted. In the months that followed that phone call, I began to understand something about the narrative I'd been telling myself. The story of the underestimated man, quietly building his empire, waiting for the moment when he could prove everyone wrong. It was a satisfying story. It was a story where I was the hero and Margaret was the villain. It was also, I came to realize, incomplete. The complete story was that I had married a woman who was ambitious and insecure and deeply afraid of not being enough. And instead of meeting that fear with compassion, I had responded with withdrawal. Instead of saying, yes, let's build something together and let's be honest about what that means, I had said, no, I'm going to protect myself by not letting you see all of me. The tragedy wasn't that she'd misjudged me. The tragedy was that we'd both misjudged what partnership actually required. I continued to work, but differently now. Not to prove anything, but because I enjoyed it. I consulted with younger advisors, shared what I'd learned about markets and about human nature. I began to volunteer at a nonprofit that provided financial literacy training to people who'd never had access to that knowledge. There was something deeply satisfying about helping someone understand that they had more power over their financial future than they'd believed possible. I thought often about Margaret's fear, the fear of not having enough, of not being enough, of falling behind. I recognized that fear in myself too, though I'd never articulated it that way. My whole financial strategy had been built on the conviction that security required caution, that enough required planning, that peace required control. Margaret had been running from the same fear in the opposite direction, pursuing more, always more, trying to outrun the sense of inadequacy. Neither of us had been right. And both of us had been right. At a conference in San Francisco, I encountered someone who knew Derek, the financial advisor who'd suggested we restructure our portfolio. Someone mentioned that his firm had collapsed in 2019, caught up in a fraud investigation. Derek himself had lost everything, his credentials, his reputation, a substantial amount of his own money in the fallout. I felt something like sadness when I heard this. Not because I was glad he'd failed, but because it confirmed what I'd already understood. His aggressive strategies, his promises of doubling portfolios in 5 to 7 years, his insistence that we were being too conservative. It had all been built on sand. The market had been kind to people like him for a while, but eventually, reality caught up. Margaret had wanted to follow someone like Derek. That was the real tragedy. Not that I'd been underestimated. but that we'd both been tempted by the promise of more, always more, and that I'd become the guardian against that temptation, while she'd become consumed by it. 2 years after the separation, I attended a charity gala, not the kind Margaret used to frequent, but a smaller affair supporting financial literacy in underserved communities. I was there to speak about the importance of long-term planning and the dangers of comparison. As I was leaving, I saw her. Margaret was there with someone, a man I didn't recognize, younger than her, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from wealth. She was laughing, genuinely laughing, the way she used to laugh when we were young and the future seemed unlimited. I didn't approach her. I simply watched for a moment, not to judge, not to assess, but to confirm what I already knew. She'd moved on. She'd built her life, expanded her business, found someone new. She was happy in the way that people are happy when they stop measuring their joy against someone else's success. I was happy too, not in the same way. But I was at peace in a way that happiness measured against the old metrics would never have allowed. On the drive home, I thought about the question Robert had asked me, whether peace was the same thing as being happy. I still didn't have a complete answer, but I understood something I hadn't understood before. Happiness, the kind that Margaret was experiencing now, was built on moving forward. It required letting go of what you'd been, what you'd done, what had been done to you. It required faith that the future was open, that new things were possible, that you weren't bound by old failures. Peace, the kind I'd found, was built on understanding. It required seeing clearly, seeing what had happened, why it had happened, what role you'd played in it. It required the difficult work of accepting that you were both right and wrong, both hero and villain, both capable and limited. I don't know which is better. I suspect they're different kinds of things, requiring different kinds of courage. What I do know is this. I spent 43 years building a life with someone who couldn't see what I was building. Then I spent 2 more years proving that I'd been right to build it. And then I spent another 2 years understanding that being right wasn't actually the point. The point was that I had built something, that I had done it with my own hands, my own mind, my own discipline, that no one could take that from me, and no one needed to validate it for it to be real. The point was that I'd loved someone, and that love had been real, even though it hadn't been enough to hold us together. And that was a tragedy, but it was also simply life. People love each other. People fail each other. People move on. The point was that in protecting myself, I'd become someone I had to learn to know again. And that work, that quiet, unglamorous work of understanding yourself, was worth more than any settlement, any vindication, any moment where someone finally saw you the way you'd always wanted to be seen. Money, I learned, doesn't actually prove anything about your worth. It just proves that you made good decisions about numbers. Your decisions about how to live, how to love, how to treat people when you had the power to hurt them, those prove something. Those leave marks. I would do it differently if I could. I would tell her the truth earlier. I would ask for what I needed instead of protecting myself from what I feared. I would choose vulnerability over control, even knowing how it might end. But I can't do it differently. I can only understand it differently. And maybe that's the real dividend. Not the money that compounds in accounts, but the understanding that compounds in your mind over years of quiet reflection. Maybe enough, in the end, isn't a number at all. It's the moment when you stop measuring and simply live, when you stop proving and simply exist, when you understand that being underestimated by someone who doesn't matter is irrelevant, because you've finally learned to estimate yourself. That's what I know now. Sitting in my quiet condo with my ocean view and my substantial portfolio and my solitary peace. I was right about the money. I was wrong about what the money meant. And somehow, understanding both of those things at the same time is where wisdom begins.